Welcome to Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree is part of the Public Square Media network of podcasts that seek to bring an LDS perspective into the public square. I'm your host, Carl Cranney. I have a PhD in religion and have written on the intersection of religious themes in pop culture. And I'm a Latter-day Saint, and joining me today is, of course, my co-host, Liz.
I'm Liz Busby. I teach writing at BYU, and I study the intersection of religion and science fiction and fantasy.
And we have a new guest joining us today. Joshua, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Joshua Richardson. I'm happily married for 29 years, father of 6, and mother of soon-to-be 4.
Today, we will be talking about eternity. Director David Frenier's jaunt into questions of eternal marriage and the nature of the afterlife that seemed very Latter-day Saint to us. It was suggested that A24 is trying to create its own Mormon horror cinematic universe. With this movie and 2024's Heretic, sadly there seem to be no future projects that fit this theme from the studio, and this one is more romantic comedy anyway, but I thought that was interesting framing. First, we're going to get into our best books segment, where we each recommend one thing that we are watching, reading, or listening to. Liz, why don't you kick us off this time?
Sure. I am listening to a book called Jane Austen's Bookshelf by Rebecca Romney. The author is a rare books dealer, so she collects rare books and sells them and trades them. And this book is inspired by her love of Jane Austen and realizing that Jane Austen was actually influenced by a lot of other female writers that we don't continue to consider part of the canon, but were very popular in her day. And so she sets out to find out more about these authors and why they're no longer considered part of the canon, and read their books and collect interesting editions of them. So it's a combination of kind of a history of literature as well as, exciting book collecting chase, learning about different editions of rare books and how that whole business works. So I just am loving it. I had no idea when I picked it up that the author is actually a former Latter-day Saint. So she relates a little bit to the culture of the church in terms of how men and women relate and some of the issues that she saw before she left the church. So there's some of that content in there as well. I'm really enjoying it. It's incredibly fun. I'm about 2/3 of the way through. It's Jane Austen's Bookshelf by Rebecca Romney.
I'll go next. My wife and I together have been reading The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. It's a fun series that I am enjoying quite a bit because it just kind of brings all of the tropes and mashes them together. And so you've got vampires and fairy and angels, and there's one character who has literally a sword that has a piece of one of the nails that put Christ on the cross, whose faith is so powerful that Dresden can just feel it radiating off of him when he's like, "Please, Lord, bless us as we go into this den of vice." And how do you put all of these things in together? We're just having a great time reading them, and it's fun to have a project to read with my wife. So I listen to the audiobooks when I'm working out usually, and she reads the books, and we kind of have a rule that you don't start the next book until the other spouse has completed that one. And so we're kind of reading them in sequence together, and it's been a delightful project, both as a couple, but also as just a fun fantasy, noir, mystery sort of series. And so The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher is something that I recommend. And Joshua, why don't you give us your recommendation for our listeners this time?
I just finished re-listening to, actually, because this is possibly the best audiobook I've ever listened to. Several years ago, my wife and I listened to Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary, and both loved the story. I don't know if you guys have read that, but the same guy who wrote The Martian, they made the movie with Matt Damon. Next movie's coming out. There you go.
Those of you none of you can see it because we're not doing video anymore, but I'm literally holding up my borrowed friend's copy of Project Hail Mary that I finished like 3 days ago.
Yes. Well, I will tell you, the story is great. The audio version of it is worth getting because the narrator is so good, and the way that they do some of the, and I don't want to spoil some things, but some of the ways that they do narration is so well done. It's just a fabulous audiobook to listen to. So I just re-listened to it and finished it the day before yesterday. It's very good. I'm excited for the movie.
Me too.
I think it's going to be a great movie. Maybe we'll do an episode on it. Who knows?
That would be great.
We will have links to all these recommendations on our website, popcultureapricottree.com. Buying through these links helps support our podcast, so we can keep bringing you conversations about the true and the beautiful in pop culture. And now on to our main discussion of eternity. I think, Liz, you're the one who made this point in the show notes, that the vibe of this show is very much the good place. There's this kind of fun, quirky afterlife with lots of shenanigans to get up to, and people learn about themselves, and it has a very similar feel to it. And I like that. We're talking about this, of course, because it's a very Latter-day Saint question to say, well, we believe in eternal families, but what happens if you have a widow or a widower situation, or a divorce, remarriage, and all sorts of things happen in the messiness of mortality. And so this taps into a lot of those kinds of themes, and I thought it handled them quite well. But maybe before we get into those specifics, what were your overall thoughts on the movie itself? Joshua, we'll have you go first.
I really enjoyed it. In fact, I watched it and asked my wife if she had seen it, and she said she hadn't. I would actually be willing to rewatch it with you if you want to watch it. And I found just the dynamic of the question of, which of these guys is she going to choose for an eternity, just an interesting question, because I've had these conversations with multiple people in my different callings. And so I was fascinated to kind of see how they handled it.
I was impressed that it was actually a lot less stressful than I was worried it was going to be. I think it's just because they have those good place vibes. It's very funny and humorous and light. And so it doesn't get too angsty or drama-ish like it possibly could with this premise. The one thing that bothered me pretty much the whole movie was the premise that it sets up. Her first husband died in the Korean War, and she married this other guy and lived her whole life, and they both died at a pretty old age. And then we meet her younger husband in the afterlife, her first husband who passed away. And in the life scenes, everyone was like, oh, he was so handsome. It was really cool. And then we meet him, and I'm like, this is the handsome guy. I think the second husband was actually better looking. So I don't know if I approve of the casting. Maybe it's just my taste in men. I don't know. Maybe I like the safe dad type. But, like, he has huge ears. So the whole time I'm like, they're making jokes about how, oh, this guy's better looking. Obviously, she's going to go with him. And they're not landing for me because I'm like, what? But anyway, that was just my little quirk, but I enjoyed the movie a lot.
So if you were casting it, you would have switched the two main male actors then.
It definitely came off that you were supposed to feel like the first husband was just this 10 out of 10, right? They kept referring to him as perfect. There was this sense of like, he's the ideal. It didn't feel like it was a Larry, the second husband. It was supposed to be like this. He's a 6 and he's up against a 10. I thought I had the same impression as Liz. I didn't think it was the discrepancy between the way the two guys looked was so sharp that she should get flushed when Luke walks in the room. That wasn't convincing. It did feel more like Luke, the first husband, was more comfortable in his skin. He did have kind of a sort of just this calm, suave demeanor. I came off of it thinking the guy, he just feels a little more Paul Newman-esque or, James Dean-esque, where it just felt more comfortable in his skin than the Miles Teller character.
Well, to be fair, he'd had like 60 years to get used to this version of him. Whereas Larry started off as this 87-year-old man, chokes on a pretzel, finds himself in like a 30-year-old body. Just very different. He's probably got a little bit of a sticker shock, so to speak. Not sticker shock.
Speaking of that, I think it's really interesting how they dealt with what age are you going to be when you're resurrected? Because that's also a very Latter-day Saint question, right? Like, what does a perfect eternal body look like?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that you are resurrected as whatever age you were the happiest is really interesting and a crucial plot point. But I thought that was a fascinating way to deal with it.
Yeah, perfect example. Miles Teller's character, the second husband, when he talked about when he was at his happiest, and that was how he looked, was when his child was born. And he said, it felt like Joan and I were a team. And I love that idea that it's almost inscribed on your being when you're happiest, and that manifests. And I thought it was funny that they said, that's why there's so many, 10-year-olds. There aren't very many teenagers here, but there's a lot of 10-year-olds.
And one of the things I did actually, and I want to ask you about this a little later on because it's not super central to the point of the movie, but I would pause it and walk up to the screen and read the descriptions of the different eternities because I wanted to see like what were they all. And it was interesting. Like one of them is a baby eternity where you are just a baby who is just fed and swaddled and loved and you for all eternity. That's just your existence. And I was like, I can see the appeal, but I feel like you'd have to have been like show up in the afterlife as an infant or else it's going to be very weird. But anyway, it even says parents will be assigned to you. It reminds me of something that I heard once from Sister Hinckley, President Hinckley's wife, who, by the way, if you ever watch a video of her, there's one of her at a BYU women's conference with her daughter. President Hinckley got his sense of humor from her, but hers is like 10 times better than his. It is so hilarious. But she said, someone asked her, how old do you want to be when you're resurrected? And she thought about it. She's like, probably in my 50s. And that just surprised me so much because, of course, everybody's like, oh, I'm resurrected as a 21-year-old because that's right, peak of our physical whatever. And that was interesting to me that she would say that she would want to be resurrected in her 50s. Goes to show, probably doesn't really matter. We're talking about like resurrected bodies that exist, as far as I'm aware, outside of time and space as we currently understand them. So how much do these factors even matter? But it's an interesting thought experiment, certainly. I believe very strongly the teaching that like not one hair of our head will be lost, but what does that mean in a body that can enter like locked rooms like Christ's does? I don't know, but it's a fun thought.
Well, apparently, according to this movie, it means it will be fully functional. This is a very important point in the movie where it was like, okay, I know a couple of women who did not get past that conversation in watching this movie. They actually walked out because they were like, is this the way the rest of the movie is going to be? I thought it was fine. I was still eye rolling to me, but it was fun.
I thought it was funny that was Joan's reaction too. She kind of was like, oh, Larry. And just, that was the reaction. And then he kind of stops, she's like, caught up in this moment of, you don't understand like the stress of what's going on. And he says, listen, I know what's going to make you happy. He said, squatting. And he said, just squat. And she's like, oh, whatever. And she squats and she's like, oh. She's like, and then she comes back up and he's like, I know, right? It's amazing. And they just sit there like are moving their bodies like it's amazing. And he starts jumping around. So I thought that was great that, that your body is fully functional in like all these ways. And they were both just enjoying this moment. And I love that he thought, I know what is going to make her happy is like, your knees are working again.
It's so very embodied, right? It's like very much, it's not heaven if you don't have a physical body, and those sensations are part of it. Like realizing you can move and like the joy of physical movement, right?
Right. It's something I think that our tradition within Christianity does better than any of the others is just the joy that we have with our physical bodies, that is part of what the plan of salvation entails, is all of us getting resurrected bodies at some point so we can feel the wind through our hair. Most of the other Christians sort of running, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but running off of sort of Greek philosophers who are like, no, man, these bodies are terrible. We want to just be able to think without any of these mortal, worldly, earthy distractions, like whether or not I'm fully functional and can squat or whatever else that, the movie implies. But for us, the spirit and the body together, only in that combination is a fullness of joy possible. And I love that was part of this movie. Just the idea that whatever happens, they have their bodies and they have the ones that they want. And as somebody who has been specifically forbidden from doing deep squats by my doctor after I broke my knee a couple summers ago, I can see why someone would be like, oh, wow, this is nice, because that is not an experience I'm going to personally have until I get resurrected. So, that resonated with me. So maybe another interesting thought that I wanted to get into was something that I enjoyed doing was going through and reading all of the different descriptions of the eternities. This, I think, also suffers from the same problem The Good Place did, which was just a lack of imagination as to what heaven could be like. In The Good Place, of course, they're all just bored to tears, and eventually they have to figure out a way to, like, unmake themselves and return their drop to the ocean of the universe or whatever. But in this one, it's like, well, you can sit on a beach for eternity, but that's it. no other choices. And part of me is like, okay, where's my holodeck eternity? Because I think all of the others are encompassed within.
That was an interesting aspect that I thought the vendor hall, the convention center vendor hall, it was a hilarious little bit. But it was interesting to me that the idea that, well, okay, obviously there's some aspect that you're looking for, and it's beach holidays, or you want to be a baby forever, or you want to be in 1940s Germany without all the Nazis, which I thought was a funny one too. And, just like there's some specific thing you are looking for and that you want to experience for the rest of eternity. I thought, that doesn't strike me as the human condition. We love variety. So I thought that was an interesting aspect of the story, that you have to make a choice on what is the one thing that you loved in your life that you want to do forever.
And I think it's partly like the conception of eternity that a lot of people have is eternity means being one thing forever, being the same forever. And we have the concept that eternity means eternal growth and eternal increase. Like, I don't think a Latter-day Saint writer would design a heaven this way, right? Like, this is not the way we picture things, that it's going to stay the same forever and you pick one thing that you enjoy that experience forever and just stay there. We picture growth and change and infinite experiences and new people and helping your eternal children to also progress and just all of these things rather than a static state.
I did find it interesting that the two different environments that were shown for the dates, one with Luke was very much a kind of this ideal childless couple environment where it was all about that couple having their time together for eternity. And then on the date with Larry, the second husband, it's the beach, but it's not just this serene, quiet beach. It's tons of people there. There's old guys sunning. There's middle-aged people walking around, and you got throwing a ball and hit Larry. You got kids in the background, on a swing set. And I thought it was a much more messy kind of environment compared to sort of this clean couples weekend environment on the other date.
Wonder if that was deliberate, because the relationship with Luke was childless, not because they didn't want to, because the marriage had ended because he had died in the Korean War, which, as a side note, the way they threw shade at the Korean War veterans, I thought that was so funny. It made me laugh out loud, but sort of in that awkward way, you're like, am I supposed to be laughing about this? Of course, we honor the people who died in the Korean War, but like Larry says,
but it's not World War II.
But it's not World War II. It's not one of the good ones. Like, okay.
I love he says, it's not the war.
It's not the war, right? But I wonder if that was deliberate, though. The Larry date is more like their life, which had kids and grandkids. I think he leaves him like a great-grandkid at one point by the time they both passed. And the date with Luke is just the two of them. Feels very honeymoon-ish. And that was interesting. Which brings me up to an interesting point that I thought was lacking here is there was almost no discussion of whether they wanted to see their kids in the afterlife. It was just focused on the two husbands. And while I think that is kind of true in a Latter-day Saint sense, that like your husband and you, or your wife and you, go on to the high degree of the celestial kingdom, and your children do the same thing with their spouses. But surely we still have some kind of relationship with them. And that just seemed completely absent from this movie. And I know it's only a 2-hour movie. There's only so much you can get in, but it's just like, oh, I really hope that my kids, how awkward would it have been if one of the kids dies and their spouse, and they go to mountain eternity and meet mom and her first husband, who's not your dad, who's now shunted off to some other eternity, right? Like, they didn't deal with any of these issues. The idea that you want to be with those you love, it's not just your spouse.
So we do have the one line where I don't remember what they were called, the eternity attendant tells Larry, oh, you can choose to go be with your parents, but then you're with your parents for eternity, right? And it's interesting that, like, obviously horrific, like it's played off as a joke that like, oh no, I don't want to hang out with my parents for eternity. But then part of the reason that Joan eventually chooses Larry is that they've had this family together. And presumably that's because they like their kids. And so, but do they feel the same way about their parents that Larry feels about his parents? It's such a strange asymmetry that this movie is kind of playing on us, that like It's great to raise a family together, but your parents are terrible and you don't want to be around them. Like, interesting.
That comment stood out to me when he asked his TripAdvisor or whatever, can I go be with my parents? And she said, yeah, but then you're with your parents forever.
Afterlife coordinator. That's what they're called.
The one thing that I did notice also in terms of the distinction between the two places was just kind of the easy familiarity that was there between Joan and Larry when they're laying in the boat and they're talking and she's got kind of her arm in his, and there's just sort of this easy familiarity. And he asks, how was the funeral? And she says, it was nice. I mean, you would have pretended to have hated it, but it was nice. And then she says, the kids were devastated. And he asks, who was the most devastated? And there's just sort of this kind of jaunty relationship between the two of them that felt much more comfortable. And when Luke and Joan are taking the train to their place, the mountain place, there's kind of this awkward sort of like, I don't know what to say. They're just kind of sitting there and they're talking a little bit, but it just didn't feel as natural a conversation as she has with Larry. And that stood out to me also.
It is really interesting because usually in a rom-com, it's all about like choosing the person who makes you feel that sparkly kind of like falling in love feeling, right? And that's what Luke is supposed to represent, this fiery love that he's so handsome and she just feels totally in love with him and totally helpless. And Larry is someone who she feels comfortable and at ease with, which is where I think every relationship that keeps going ends up, right? You cannot stay in that phase of like falling in love forever. And that's not what love is. That's part of what love is. And it should be part of the experience. But eventually, if you stay together long enough, you get to this kind of relationship where it's more like you're so comfortable around the other person that it's just almost like being alone, even though you're together, because you can just anticipate each other so much and you just feel comfortable with them. And it's interesting that the message of this movie is that's actually what love is and not what most romance movies are going to point you towards, right? It's fascinating to me how this movie got made in Hollywood because it's just such a strangely countercultural message.
I don't know that I entirely agree with that assessment that Hollywood, because The Notebook is another classic romance, not a romantic comedy, certainly, but the whole sort of framing device that he's reading her dementia-addled old lady version of her, their story, so that she can pop out of that and be herself and remember him for just a few minutes every other day or so. Like, I loved that idea from The Notebook. It's not completely absent, even if, yes, most of us think of romance as the first few stages of true love, but not the, are you going to be with this person at the end of their life when you're both in rest homes and you have caretakers and you can't quite control your body the same way and you just are old and gnarly and, whatever else. There is a power to that I'm glad they tapped into a little bit here. Even the fact that Larry gives Joan up when he realizes that because her hair is longer, she must have been happier with her first husband, because that's how she's been resurrected or instantiated in this afterlife, whatever we're calling that. Luke never said that. At least I don't remember him ever saying, like, as long as you're happy, I'm happy. Like, he felt a little more selfish. And I don't think this is necessarily a character flaw. I mean, he was like a 25-year-old man who died in the Korean War and didn't get to live his life out. Of course he wants his wife to join him in the afterlife so he can have all the things that he didn't get in life because he got, tragically cut short. But Larry had the depth of character and relationship with her to say, I just want you to be happy. I think that's with Luke. I'm going to let you go. And that was astonishing to me.
And Luke, in contrast, when they're on their date and she mentions her kid or grandkid or whatever, and you can see Luke kind of getting irritated and, rather than thinking, I want to learn what my wife did, while he's irritated by the fact that she's talking about her kids. And, it plays off as, he says, I'm just upset we didn't get the chance to do it. But you can tell he's very irritated by having to listen to that. And in contrast to Larry, like you said, who eventually realizes as he's sitting there talking to Luke that, oh my gosh, her hair is long. And he runs to tell her, like, you never had long hair with me, which means that Luke was when you were at your happiest. I loved that. I found that very endearing, that Larry, because at the end of it, he said, you need to go with Luke. That is who you should be with. That's who you were obviously happiest with. And she says, what about you? And he says, this will only work if you're actually happy. Like, you can't be wondering that. You have to go and be happy. And that's going to be how I'm going to be happy, is knowing that you're happy. I love that. I also found it endearing, that period where Luke and Larry kind of bonded. I'm kind of a sucker for male bonding experiences. And I think it's because I'm the oldest of 5 boys. And, that kind of fighting that eventually comes around to, being just, tight as thick as thieves. And I love that bonding between Luke and Larry for that moment of realizing that she is their common connection. And that obviously speaks to something that they have in common, that she was attracted to both of them.
I will second your endorsement of that scene between the 2 husbands. I thought it was great. I also am the oldest of 5 boys, and Susan is the youngest of 3 girls. And so a lot of the male bonding, Susan just doesn't understand. And I think that's very interesting. She's like, why are you guys on the floor wrestling? I'm like, because we're having fun. I was in my 30s when that happened. I'm not ashamed to say. But it is a great scene between the 2 of them. And I think there is something very true to form about male bonding there, that even in this fairly traumatic, very stressful situation, dealing with matters of eternity, you can still have a drink together. I mean, we can't because we're Latter-day Saint, but you can eat ice cream or something and hang out and still enjoy each other's company, get to know each other, and still feel good about the other person, even though in these circumstances, you're kind of enemies. And yet, you can still become friends.
So, is this the point where we bring up polygamy? Because for a second, are like, let's do a poly relationship, well, straight the same world, it'll be fine. And that's pretty much, that would ruin the movie. So we can't accept that. But this scene between Luke and Larry reminded me of reading about women in polygamous relationships, right? Where, yes, there is this tension of like, when he's with you, he's not with me. And how do I get my fair share of time? And there's somewhat a rivalry aspect, but there's also somewhat a sistership that develops in some of these relationships. It's always hard, but it's also always like, we all belong to the same family. And there's sometimes some sister connection there, in the same way that I felt like Luke and Larry were kind of having like a brotherly bonding moment there. You can't really have one without the other. They're both going to be there in any kind of relationship like that. But it does kind of tell us that like there are some ways that this can work, but even though it's going to be painful for a lot of people, and I think it was for a lot of the saints who did practice polygamy, right? It was a hard thing. I don't think it was easy for most people, but there were also good things that came out of it, even though it was always hard.
The term is sister wives. In that scene, could we call them husband brothers? Brother husbands, I guess, right? Like this is an interesting analogy to former experiences of people from our church. You're right, though. It would ruin the point of the movie. Like, she has to pick one of these 2. But I mean, that gets into sort of the reason why this is such an interesting Latter-day Saint movie. And Joshua, before we started recording, you talked about a training you had recently been in, one of your leadership callings. Just this question about what are our messy mortal families with, sometimes there's divorces and people die too young, and there's blended families and mixed faith marriages. And what do you do when people can't get sealed in the temple? How is all of this messiness going to shape out in the next life in a way that is both just and fair? And these are weighty questions that I think this movie does a good job of kind of addressing and helping you think through some of the ramifications of that. So
yeah, it was interesting. So in this particular meeting, it was Elder Rasban, and he was talking about, somebody asked him what the afterlife was going to look like. And the person laid out a particular scenario and a question that one of their members had. And Elder Rasban kind of started it off by saying, what we know about the life after this is so infinitesimally small that it's difficult to really paint with confidence very many pictures about what it's going to look like. But he said, what we do know is that the potential for repentance, growth, love, and the capacity to change still exists. And so he just said, what our responsibility is just to love the people that we're struggling with and know that God will have no unhappy situation for those who keep their covenants, that he wants us to be happy. So when they did in passing, they mentioned, well, you could all go to the same eternity. And Joan says, that could work. And you see like, she's like, oh, I don't have to make a choice. And both the guys are like, no, not at all. No, this is not going to happen. Immediately dismissed. We can't have this be the resolution. We got to, keep this tension for the movie. I was actually, because I'm watching this with my wife and I'm sitting there thinking that I love my wife so much. And Larry says, I don't care where we end up. We could choose someplace other than the beach, just as long as we're together and Luke isn't floating around. And I thought about if I were in this situation and it was a choice between losing my wife or having to, be with her and a second husband if I died early. I want very much to be with her. And I don't know what I would do in that situation, but I know I want very much to be with her. I think God loves us so infinitely and allows us significant time to kind of resolve these things. That was one of the things that also struck me as really unrealistic about this was that you have a week to make a decision on what your eternity is going to be. And I think that is so wildly unrealistic. I know they have to create some kind of dramatic tension for the movie, but the idea that you got to choose, your 7 days are up, you're going to have to go live in the basement if you haven't chosen that. I think God is going to give us all the time in the world to figure out what is it that you want to do in the eternities. What are the choices that you want to make for the eternities?
The movie is a little inconsistent on that point because you've got a week to choose, or you can choose to stick around for 65 years like Luke does to wait. Like, I would totally stick around and wait for my kids to show up and the rest of my family. But then do they want to stick around for their kids to show up? Eventually, the whole Cranney family, I feel like, would just be like filling the entire hotel waiting for it and not ever making a decision about where to go next because we're still waiting for the next people to come because we keep having new babies and the generations keep happening on Earth. But I think you're right. That is just there for dramatic tension, just to ratchet things up, even though it's not quite entirely clear because the afterlife coordinators were also once humans now who have decided, like the Good Place, like Tahani ends up in the Good Place being sort of one of the architects of people's individual universes to help them progress morally. And so that is a similarity between the two of them.
It's interesting as well that she is able to pull off this re-choice, right? They've all been told you choose once and then you can't ever choose again, or you get hauled off to the void. But we have our dramatic chase scene, and then she arrives in this afterlife with Larry, and it's fine. And everybody knows they're there. Presumably, if they really needed to arrest her, they could find her. It's not that hard, but it's fine now. So it's the rules matter until they don't matter.
Right. I feel like the implication wasn't explicitly stated. I even went back and listened to you can have the subtitles, you can have the audio track that describes the action that's going on as well, just in case there was some hint there as to where they actually were. I think the implication is it's one of those abandoned eternities that nobody really checks up on anymore. Although I don't know why 1950s suburbia isn't PC like they imply some of the other ones. They're like, oh, we got rid of the racist ones, so we don't send people to those anymore, which I thought was quite funny. I mean, yeah, all the Nazis who died and didn't want to go to the 1940s Weimar world where the Weimar Republic never fell. Where did they go? I'm not sure that's an eternity that a lot of other people are going to join them, which is interesting. You get what you want forever, right? There's our C.S. Lewis quote. The blessed say we've always been in heaven. The damned say we've always been in hell, and they both speak true. So yeah, that was an ending to the movie to me that kind of ruined it for me because I'm like, I am waiting for the eternal gendarmerie to show up and arrest her and throw her into the void. And then what's Larry going to do? Is he going to join them? Is she going to jump into the void after her? Yikes.
I think it's interesting also that they have that memory hall. Every eternity has a hall of memories where you can go and you can see your life. I thought it was also interesting that you can either go in on your own and see your life, or you can go in with a second person and you see the shared moments of your lives. But Joan keeps going back when she's with Luke, she keeps going back and watching her experience with Larry and the kids. And you see her just repeatedly, and she's just sitting down in front of the displays, just watching it. And you can see that she's just absorbed in all these memories. And she keeps going back day after day to the point that the guy who runs the ticket machine says, listen, lady, it's really not healthy to keep coming back to this every day. I think, but you have it here in eternity. People are going to go and watch this, but that created the dissatisfaction for it to approach Luke and say, I made a mistake. And, I think he realizes, to your point about the void, she realizes, I would rather risk the void to try and correct this mistake than to spend eternity knowing that I made a mistake.
I also wonder, they never address this, and this feels like the Latter-day Saint issue that we talk about with the messiness of families. If you really can only be paired off in couples, we're not sure how that's all going to shake out. I don't remember where I read this, but there was like a Latter-day Saint, Liz, you're the person I would ask you about this actually, speculative fiction story about a guy who dies, goes to the afterlife, and he ends up, there was like a painting he had seen of some woman from like the 1600s or whatever, and he ends up marrying her in the afterlife because he finds her. And why could Luke not find someone who wants to go hang out with him in Mountain World? Like, are they stuck with the relationships that they had just in life? I feel like there would be ample opportunity to reshuffle the deck if you needed to in this kind of afterlife. Certainly there will be on some level in the Latter-day Saint view of afterlife.
I think it's somewhat just like the view of eternity again, right? Like it's unchangeable. So we're not going to consider possibilities or growth or new relationships. We're going to consider which relationships do you want to continue. Also, just movie plot. We can't have that happening. You could have, I guess. You could have had like a third wheel here that shows up, or a fourth wheel in this case, who shows up and is like, oh, all of a sudden she decides to go with Larry, and then like this person steps in and solves it. You could do it, but then we don't have this moment where Larry gives Joan her freedom and then Joan realizes she made a mistake, which is like really beautiful of them both realizing that they care a lot about each other and that they're willing to give up a lot to be together. The idea that you're willing to risk the void for someone, risk giving up your entire existence forever for someone, is pretty romantic. We love that in a Hollywood movie. Very nice.
One thing I wanted to bring up that I thought was interesting, it's kind of a throwaway moment, but as she's running away and making her escape and they're chasing her through memories, but like ones that weren't in the Hall of Memory, and they're going back through her life with her parents yelling at her and things like that. I thought that was very interesting. It was so short that I'm not sure what to do with it. I just wondered if either of you had any thoughts on sort of that. It's only there just as she's jumping through scene to scene to scene as these guys are chasing her. I loved Elizabeth Olsen crawling out of the washing machine, right, or the dryer. Anybody have any thoughts on that? It was interesting to me, but I don't know quite what to do with it in the context of the movie.
I had that same thought. I felt like there was supposed to be some kind of meaning to seeing like her parents arguing, or the two military gentlemen showing up to let her know that Luke had passed away. But it didn't seem to create any kind of anchor back to what the message of the movie was. It felt kind of like a throwaway thing that I couldn't connect back to what I was supposed to take away from the story.
Yeah, I think it doesn't quite all come together, but I can take a stab at interpretation because that's my job. That's what we do as literary critics, is make interpretations. But I think part of it is the whole rest of the movie has been about selecting what you want and tailoring your life to be exactly the way you pictured it and perfect forever, right? And part of what Joan is doing in running away from that is accepting her whole life as it was. And so maybe that's part of the traveling through these memories, is saying, no, your whole life is not picking the perfect moment, resurrecting in the perfect body, and then going to the place where you can continue to experience that one moment forever. But to say like, yes, these bad things happened in my life and they are also part of me. And I have to accept that in order to truly move on to this relationship with Larry, where we can go on and, it seems like, live the similar kind of life that they did, it feels like there might actually be growth in this 1950s world that they go to, where they're, are kids playing on the street? Or are they going to raise another family together? Because that's what this life is about living in a family. So I don't know. So it feels like almost a flight from static, pick your happiest moment and stay there, to accepting trouble, accepting difficulty, and that we made it through together, Joan and Larry, and we're going to continue on and grow. So if you wanted like maximum Latter-day Saint interpretation of it, they chose the eternity of growth instead of the eternity of static happiness.
Okay, Liz, you may have just fixed something that has been bugging me since like 2006 in my master's program, because we were talking with this particular professor and we were going over Karl Barth's view of the afterlife, which, as I recollect, is that God takes your earthly life into his existence in the afterlife and accepts it and loves it, whatever else, but there's no continuation of you as like a person or a being or a thinking. There are no new experiences. Your life becomes an eternal DVD in the mind of God. And I remember this moment because the whole class started pushing back on Dr. Jones. And I was really happy with that because, and she would stop at one point and said, I don't understand why you're all pushing back so much on this. And I wanted to raise my hand and say, because you finally said something that was so far out of the bound of normal Christianity that I'm not the only one who wants to scream at you because you're just so far off base. Like even the liberal Protestants were like, no, there has to be some kind of heaven. It's not just like God accepts your life with all the suffering here and accepts it. Like, but Joan picking her whole messy life over the static, like maybe Latter-day Saints could split the difference, right? It's not just a static eternal heaven where you're sitting on a cloud playing the same songs over and over on your harp or contemplating God, right? There's growth and change and dynamism and things like that in the Latter-day Saint view of afterlife. So you can accept both the messiness of life, which helps morally form us and allows us to understand that, right, we're here to learn from our mistakes and grow and change and repent and do better and then be cleansed by the atonement of Christ.
And learn from suffering, right? Suffering is a part of life, and it's a needed part of life, according to our theology, right? It's not a mistake.
Yes.
Suffering is something we need, and getting rid of it is not good.
Yeah, and I think that actually comes back to the quote by C.S. Lewis that, the damned will say, I was always in hell, and the blessed will say, I was always in heaven. I think everything gets contextualized in the relationship that we have to God. The moment that you see where the baby's crying and Larry's holding the baby, and I think his, pooped their pants or something, and it's obviously a stressful evening. And he talks about later that moment where he's happiest with the baby, and he felt like he and Joan were a team. And so all that suffering, all the trial and challenge gets contextualized in this relationship, and the growth that happens because that relationship is working together to try and accomplish something.
Even the idea of choosing the time when you have a baby in your life as your happiest moment versus the time when you were romantically fulfilled as your happiest moment is such an interesting contrast, right? The moment you become a parent is a moment when you give away some of your freedom, when you give away some of your ability to choose exactly what makes you feel fulfilled at any one moment. You're choosing to accept a being into your life who is going to rely on you for the rest of its life, even when they're not living with you anymore. It's a giving up of something, but it's also a growth of you as a person and realizing that it's not all about you. It is about so many other things and so many other people. And so that's a really interesting message. That's like, no, actually, that's the happiest moment.
I love that idea too, that you have a child and forever after, a piece of your heart is always walking outside of your body. And I think that's what God feels like. And he trusts us enough to send us out into the world. And a piece of him, the God who weeps, a piece of his heart is outside of his body for every single one of his children for the rest of eternity.
There is something powerful about the fact that the number one title that God likes to use is our Father in heaven. And we imitate God in as much as we can in our limited mortal way by ourselves becoming parents. which is why I'm so annoyed that the kids don't factor into this movie at all. Like, that's the moment you're very happy. Like they were the most happy. Okay, then why are you not waiting for them to come to the afterlife and join you?
We probably should put in a little note here about the absence of God in this afterlife, which is really interesting. It's another one of those things that the movie can't get distracted about because it's got somewhere to be, and we got to set this ticking time bomb so we can have the romantic drama. But the afterlife coordinator, when he asks about God, is just like, I don't know, you can decide whatever you think, wherever you want to go. Maybe there'll be a God there, or like if enough people believe it, you go to a world where there is one. It's very strange. This movie's not interested in that question, and so we're gonna mention it so we get it out of the way and say this is not what the movie's about. But it also says something about the kind of universe this is, that it's a giant convention center where you are selecting what you desire. It's a very capitalist heaven, we might say, that everyone can buy whatever they want and you can have anything under the sun that you so choose. And it affects no one else, of course, except when it does.
One of the worlds that I paused and read the description of was capitalism world. And it says, because you can't be happy unless somebody else is poor. I just thought that was so funny. And again, good place vibes. There's no God in the good place either. And so they just can't deal with that. Although part of me really wants to understand why, like, there are eternities here where it's, oh, this is the actual Christian afterlife. And I'm like, but that doesn't work. You have to have a creator. Like, you just get to gin up a version of God in this one subset of everybody else's afterlife. That seems really weird to me. But again, not the focus of the movie. And when I say I write on religious themes and pop culture, right, like this is actually the theme that I write about a lot, is that movies have to deal with a way of writing God out, because if you have an all-powerful, perfectly good character, it ruins all the dramatic tension. And so they do, for storytelling reasons, the ways that theologians have been wrestling for centuries about this problem called the hiddenness of God. And so this is just another attempt at sort of trying to sort through those philosophical issues in a universe where the story would be ruined if God appeared and could fix some of this with a wave of his hand or his magic wand, or, you know, whatever you conceive of that. So that's interesting. But yeah, like The Good Place, there's no God here. There's just Larry. No, sorry, not Larry. That's one of the, but like there's a point where the afterlife coordinators are like, right, there's like Greg, and above him is Phil, and then above him is, and then they get to the point where they're like, we went up like 4 levels and this guy gave you a special dispensation to have 2 dates and to sample 2 eternities. I'm like, well, who's above Phil? Like, at some point, this feels very Aristotle to me. Like, there has to be an unmoved mover at the top of the food chain somewhere, but we're just not going to talk about that, I guess.
The absence of God in the conversation, when he brings up, he's like, I want to talk to God. And she says, oh, I didn't realize you're one of those people. Hold on here. Do you want the Christian eternity, the Hindu eternity? And he says, wait, there's no God. But I had to just kind of lay this out. Okay, that's not the question. The question here is, what is love actually? But it's so interesting that they don't address God at all. It's Frank, and then, you know, Phil, and then, you know, whoever's above Phil.
So Joshua, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on is because you expressed interest in talking about this movie because you and your wife enjoyed it so much, but I also know you've had a lot of leadership callings in the church, and so have helped people sort of wrestle with the issues of what the messiness of mortality, how that's going to turn out in the afterlife. And I wondered if anything you want to say on that as we sort of wrap up our conversation here.
Yeah, the first time I really thought about this, I was in a ceiling room with one of my mission companions who was being married back when they did marriages for time only in the temple. And so he was being married for time only there in the temple. And they were both kneeling across the altar crying because both of them, I think, really very much wanted to be sealed. Her husband had passed away, and now, you know, they've been married longer than she was married to her first husband. And I think it was the first time where somebody who I loved, I saw they were struggling with this question of what does this mean for us after this life? And then my cousin has experienced the same thing. This is a common question when I'm meeting with people, that they're always wondering, what does this look like afterwards? And I think the fact that Elder Rasband didn't feel like he could even really lay out what that looks like, because what we know is so small, and just the sheer trust that we end up having to have in our Father in heaven, that everything is going to be made up. Joseph Smith said, all of our losses will be made up to us. And I think that includes all the things that we're not sure about, which is this relationship that I've got here, even though she has a ceiling to somebody else, that's a loss, right? And all of our losses are somehow in some way going to be made up. And I think really what it ends up coming down to when I'm talking to these individuals is to just hold tightly to their covenants and to lean on Jesus Christ, because I don't know the answers. It's a very hard experience for me as a leader to not feel like I have an answer that I can give them, to just wave a wand and, hey, I got the answer and you're good. But rather, this is going to be a difficult thing, and we're not going to know an answer in this life in all likelihood. And Jesus Christ is the only one who's going to be able to comfort you and provide you the knowledge that he knows what you're feeling and suffering and agonizing about. That's really, like President Nelson said, Jesus is always the answer.
Well, thanks for that, Joshua. I appreciate that. I know that these kinds of questions that this movie is wrestling with, even though the director and the writer is like a lapsed Catholic, just interesting. He's like, this is an interesting thought experiment. And the Latter-day Saints are all going, oh, no, this is not a thought experiment. This is lived reality for us. But I just put my sort of theologian hat on for a moment. There's sort of two scriptures I wanted to read that I think deal with these issues really well. And the first is one that I really like from Revelation chapter 21, verse 4, where it says, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. Like, I take that very seriously when God says, I will wipe away all your tears, no more sorrow. However it's going to work out, you are going to be happy. But I love your sort of last thought there, to hold your covenants, to hold to Christ, because, right, this is what Mormon talks about in Moroni chapter 7, where he talks about try to hold on to every good thing. And he says, well, how is that possible? How is it possible that ye can lay hold upon every good thing? This is Revelation 20. And then in verse 22, he says, in Christ there should come every good thing. And so God is mighty to save, and Christ is in relentless pursuit of all of us, and it'll all work out. He will wipe away all the tears. Life is complicated and messy, but heaven will not be. How do we get from here to there? I don't know, but that's the Savior's job, and he's a lot smarter than me, so. Anyway, on that note, let's jump into our ratings really quick. Our first rating is content, clean versus objectionable material. We rate it celestial, terrestrial, telestial, or outer darkness. Let's have you lead up on this one. As someone who didn't think the one guy was very handsome and didn't like the discussion about fully functional resurrected bodies, where do you put this?
To be clear, it didn't bother me. I just know people who were bothered by it. I'm a hardened English major, so I can read many things that a lot of people do not tolerate. But I think The Good Place is a good analogy for this movie. If you could enjoy The Good Place in spite of its sometimes raunchiness, then you will probably also enjoy this movie. There are a few very adult discussions, not super explicit, so I'm going to go terrestrial.
Is that what we gave The Good Place? I feel like that's what we gave The Good Place overall. You don't remember. Anyway.
We don't need to be consistent. Please, this is a podcast.
I think I will also go with terrestrial. There are a few moments that aren't strictly necessary where they're going through the Hall of Mirrors and they see one of their engagements. We'll euphemize it that way. Such a couple of moments like that. I think terrestrial is a good way to put it as well.
Agreed. Yeah, that scene in the Hall of Memories, and then I just think it was about as tame or unexplicit as you could make it, but it was still definitely a sex scene, and I think it just didn't need to be in there necessarily, but I would say terrestrial.
All right, and our next rating is artistic merit, skillful, effective use of craft, 1 to 5 popcorn balls. I'll go first on this one. I think the casting and the acting, actually, like, everybody did a great job. I kind of see your point that maybe they sort of switched Miles Teller to be the first husband, whatever. I thought they were both fine. I could see the dashing Korean War veteran and Miles Teller both as, reasonably attractive men that can help pull at this woman's heartstrings in the appropriate ways to make the movie work. But all of them, I thought, just did a great job. Even just in our discussion here, sort of the awkwardness between Luke and Joan, because they haven't been together for 65 years, and just the sheer intimacy of the relationship, not in the sexual sense, but just the familiarity with each other between Luke and Joan, even though they're played by two very old actors and then these two very young actors. I felt like they really sold that to me about how that relationship could develop and the way that would shape their conversations in this weird, sort of quirky afterlife. So just for the acting alone, I'm going to give this one 5 popcorn balls. Everything else was fine. I loved the brochures and the floor with the various people trying to hawk their different afterlives and their different eternities. It was all just quite fun. And so I'm going to give it 5 popcorn balls.
I thought Teller did playing a crotchety old. He just came across this like decades of get off Miles Teller, and I enjoyed the movie well enough that I told my wife, I said, hey, do you want to watch this movie together? And
I'm probably going to go with 4 just because I feel like there were some parts that could have been done a little bit better. Again, I wasn't amazed at the casting. I do think it's an incredibly fun movie. I was not expecting to have as much fun as I did watching it. So it's a great movie. Just a few little loose ends, especially like that bit at the end that you pointed out, Carl, with her running through the memories. Like, what was that? What's going on? I'm really interested. And we don't get any explanation. And maybe that's part of the point. But I just feel like there could have been a little bit clearer thematically wrapped up there. And a few other things. But it's a great movie.
I can jive with that. I hope we would all agree, though, that Miles Teller, Elizabeth Olsen, and Callum Turner, who's the guy who plays Luke, they had really good 3-way chemistry, which I think is rare. To have one and the other work really well happens a lot, but to have the 3 people really nail their parts. And our last one is Gospel Connections, Morally Edifying Messages. I'm pretty sure most of our listeners will know where I'm going to put it, so we're going to let Joshua go first. 1 to 5 apricots. Joshua, how would you rate this movie?
I think it's a fun romance, and I really enjoyed it. In terms of morally edifying messages, I would give it probably a 3. It got me thinking about things, but I don't know that it gave me an absent God in a situation like this really stood out and bugged me a little bit. But so I would say in terms of Gospel Connections, I'd give it a 3. It got me thinking about what would this look like. It didn't answer a whole lot of questions for me.
Actually think I'll give it 3 as well. Usually I do 4 and just say I don't give it a 5 because there's not an explicit mention of Christ or the gospel or God or anything like that. But in this case, I think they did a really good job of differentiating, we'll say that, the different aspects of love that are represented by Larry, the full lived life with the children and all that sort of messiness. And then Luke, who was basically passed away during their honeymoon phase of their marriage, and sort of getting you to think about that and what the true nature of love is. Are you going to change that person's diaper? That is true love. Or are you going to change the diaper so that your wife or your husband doesn't have to, right? Like that. These things, they're very present, but I don't feel that there was a lot of character development, not a lot of moral development between the various characters. Maybe just that moment where Larry gives Joan up. But then it works out for him in the end. He did start being the bartender in hopes that she would show up again. I feel like he was kind of hedging his bets there. So maybe 3.5, but that's where I'm going to land as well. All right, Liz, bring us home.
I think 3 is really good. I think this movie is valuable in being able to talk about why get married, which I think is such a good conversation to have, and talk about the difference between having a relationship and having a marriage. Her relationship with Luke, although they are married, feels more like a relationship that could be just a dating relationship. It's about the 2 people being fulfilled personally, versus her relationship with Larry, which is about marriage, right? And the difference between that and why that's a joyful and good thing and not a handcuffing thing. So I give it 3 apricots for that discussion.
Right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. You can find me on Threads at Carl Cranney if you'd like to reach out. Liz, where can people get in touch with you if they'd like to reach out?
You can follow my writing and book reviews on lizbusby.com.
Right. Joshua, do you have any social media you'd like to plug, or if someone wants to get in touch with you, should they just send me a message and I'll get in touch with you?
Exactly. Send Carl a message.
All right. If you want to get in touch with Joshua, send Carl a DM and I'll figure out a way to get in touch with him. Thanks for joining us on Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree. If you've enjoyed this episode, share the podcast with a friend who enjoys good movies and good conversation. You can also subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice or on YouTube. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode via email, social media, or on our website. It really makes our day as podcast hosts to hear from you. Liz, can you tell us what we will be discussing in our next episode?
In our next month's episode, we are going to be discussing Truth and Treason, a 2025 film and or miniseries about a teenage Latter-day Saint who starts a resistance movement against the Nazis. This film is directed by Matt Whitaker, and it's available to watch on many streaming platforms, so you can be ready for that conversation next time.
This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek after everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy. See you next time.